Good shape, I will tell you what. All right, let me see how many of you know this. This is the day that the Lord has made. Oh, I'm impressed, folks. I am. I didn't think that was going to go that well. This is the day that the Lord has made. And I'm glad to see you all out here in church this morning. Now, for those of you who have been here the past several weeks, you know we've been working through a piece of literature in our Bible called the Ten Commandments. That's right. And today we're going to deal with commandment number 4. Now, these first 4 that you see on this tablet to the side of me primarily deal with our relationship with God. I say primarily because all of the commandments deal in one way or another with our relationship with God, just like all of the commandments in some way or another have something to say about how we deal with each other. The question is one of focus. In the first 4, the focus is on how we relate to God. In the next 6, they concern themselves with how we relate to other people. Before we can go on, let's see if we can, from memory, name those first 4 commandments. What's number 1? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Wonderful. Number 2, I'm checking you. Yep, number 2. No graven images. That is right. Number 3. Thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. Very good. Very good. I was afraid for a moment we'd borne false witness to the 3rd commandment, but no. No, you pulled it out. That is fantastic. Do not take God's name in vain. And we learned last week that that doesn't mean so much that a violation of that commandment would be shouting out to the great JC if you stub your toe. What we learned was that that commandment at its heart is about our relationship with God. That God is God and we are not. And any time we attempt to speak in the name of God where God does not speak, any time we attempt to force our own will on others as though it were the will of the Almighty, any time we make the attempt to force God's hand, to treat Him like some sort of cosmic vending machine, that if I say the right prayer or put in the right currency of faith, that God must do this, that, or the other, that is taking God's name and our relationship with God in vain. It's taking on too much responsibility for ourselves and putting ourselves in the position of God, which is something we were never designed to do. That's an extra little mini sermon for you today. You're welcome. You're welcome. You've gotten a couple of those, you're going to get a couple more. Now, the command that we have before us this morning to honor the Sabbath is unique in many ways. First, it's stated positively. Did you notice that? Before any thou shalt not is laid out, it begins, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And there are some terms to unpack here. First, what is the Sabbath? It's a day of rest. I heard day of rest. Wonderful, that's right. It's a day set aside for rest. How long has the Sabbath been a special day? That's right. Since the beginning, that's why we are to remember it. While all of the other commands given draw from the Exodus event. Remember the prologue, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. This command goes back even farther. It goes back to the dawn of time itself. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. And on the 7th day, He rested. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. And in our story from Genesis this morning, we learned that after the entire work of creation, God rested. This tells us that built into the very fabric of life, of all that is, there's a need for rest. Do you think that God was tired after the work of creation? Do you think that He was stressed out and bummed out and burned out and brought down and needed a break of some kind? No. No, of course not, right? Of course not. But our Creator saw that inherent in all that was made, there was also a need for rest, for recreation. So on the 7th day, God made the Sabbath as a day of rest for all of creation. Productivity. That's become a defining word for our age. Productivity, trying to do more with less. Those of us who have had the pleasure to be in the workforce, especially in the last 5 years, have seen vast downsizing and right-sizing and really everything but supersizing. And in this time, while the number of our colleagues has dwindled, the overall workload has not. In fact, companies have been trying to do more and more with less and less. In my old line of work, I saw my hours worked and those of my comrades increase from an average of 54 a week to an average of 72 per week due to ordered staffing cuts. Profit margins grew as the cost of labor shrunk, and even as the industry I worked in bounced back from the recession, the order to rehire never came. The thinking was, why hire more when we can just work the ones we have a little bit harder? And then a funny thing started to happen. Dumb mistakes started getting made. Paperwork errors at first, overspending on outside goods and services, stuff like that. Then, in the midst of a recession, with a near 10% jobless rate, people started to quit en masse. In my district, I watched as over half of my colleagues quit in the course of 1 year. And these weren't people new to the job either. These were career men and women, most with over a decade of service with this company, some with upwards of 20 years, just poof, gone. Now, for those of you old enough to remember the movie The Shining, you recall that all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. You've got it. Well, all work and no rest not only leads to burnout, but it can lead to long-term harm to an individual, to a business, and to a culture. We need rest. The need for it's woven into the very fabric of the universe. We need rest and recreation. So, because God knows that merely needing it isn't enough, because humans are hard-headed, bottom-line driven critters, God commands it. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Holy. That's a funny word. It means set apart and specifically dedicated to religious use. We are to keep the Sabbath day holy. When we look around, we see not only are people stretched thinner and thinner, not only has the buzz of busyness grown louder, but when something's got to give, that something, more often than not, is Sunday morning worship. I'll tell you, I've heard it again and again. From my fellow blue-collar workers, I would hear, Sunday is my only day to sleep in, man, and I am not going to blow that opportunity getting up early to head to church. From kids, God forbid not my own, but from kids and from teenagers, I've heard, I have too much homework, I have too many extracurricular activities, I have to get to the swim meet, the soccer match, I have to do nonprofit work if I want to get into a good school later on. From my father and from those in upper management, I'd frequently hear, Sunday is for blank. Insert whatever your favorite pastime is here. Golfing, boating, fishing, gardening, laying in bed, drinking coffee, and reading the newspaper. And he would go on, I feel closer to God and more at peace with the world. On the back nine, catching a strong breeze, reeling in the big one, with my hands in the earth, sipping coffee while catching up on the events of the week. I feel closer to God doing that than I ever would sitting in a church pew or a wonderful padded seat like you have today. Such a thing is no good, people. We are designed not only to rest, but to worship. And worship is not something we can do alone. When we're alone, we can pray. When we're alone, we can read the Bible. When we're alone, we can fast. When we're alone, we can meditate. Worship is a corporate discipline. In worship, it isn't just me and my Jesus. It isn't just getting into the right mindset to commune with the Lord. Worship is a corporate act because I need you, my brother. I need you, my sister, to fully enter into the presence of God. Christ tells us in Matthew 18:20, wherever 2 or 3 of you are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of you. Just one person cannot worship. Much like just one person cannot perform an act of kindness or charity, there needs to be a giver and a recipient. Just like you need more than one person for an act of love. You need both a lover and a beloved. Just like you need more than one person to take a vote, you need more than one person to worship. In the words of the immortal philosophers Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock, it takes two to make a thing go right. Yeah, it takes two to make it out of sight. Or, for those of you in the older set, in the words of Marvin Gaye perhaps, one can have a dream, baby. Two can make a dream so real. One can talk about being in love. Two can say, oh, come on, I know y'all are this generation. How it really feels, right? It takes two, baby. It takes two. That's it. Oh, goodness gracious, folks. We're awake, right? We are, Pastor. That just wasn't very good. All right, fair. Now, this is why we gather together. And we remember Christ. We recollect His body in the form of each and every participant who comes together into worship. We discuss the affairs that affect His body. We extend to one another His peace as the body of Christ is reunited. And it feels so good. We invite the presence of that holy other into our assembly. Remember, Jesus did say that when we gather in His name, He is in our midst, not simply when we gather together. That's what makes this holy and set apart. We make our joys and concerns known as a body before God. We open our hearts and minds to a word from that old story, and we await a fresh word of interpretation from on high. Did you know that's what a sermon is at its best? I once heard it explained as Jesus, you remember Jesus, as Jesus explaining Himself to His people. That's the proclaimed word at its best, and it can only happen when we come together, and He is here in our midst. In worship, we offer the fruits of our labor to the Lord. We partake of that holy meal. We await a blessing to depart once more. In worship, there is no me and there is no you. There's just us. It's through this act that we are re-energized, we are refueled, that we are created. If you want to be recreated, don't turn to recreation, turn to the church. Turn to the holy. Forsake not the gathering of yourselves together, and turn to the one in our midst. That reminds me of a little story. Jesus was walking down the street when He saw a man who had been blind from birth. Rabbi, His disciples asked Him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin or because of his parents? Now, that sounds a little messed up to modern ears, doesn't it? That thought. But I think we can all agree that sin has the ability to blind us. And that our parents' sins, their choices, have an effect on what we're able to see and to do. But we'll get to that a little more next week. This isn't part of the story. It's just another little mini-sermon. Think of it as a 3-for-1 at this point. So y'all are welcome. You made out a little bit on this deal. Anyway, Jesus tells them it's not because of His sins or His parents' sins. This happened so that the power of God could be seen in Him. We must quickly carry out the tasks assigned us by the one who has sent us. The night is coming, and then no one can work. But while I am here in the world, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. And upon saying this, Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with His saliva, and pressed the mud over the blind man's eyes. That's sort of gross, but it's what happened. And you'll remember from our reading in Genesis that God made man out of the dust of the earth, right? Right. Well, there was a little bit more making left to do on this one. So, like His Father, Jesus continued on in the work of putting the finishing touches on creation. He told the man, go wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed. And he came back seeing. Now the man's neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, Isn't this the guy who used to sit and beg? Some said he was. And someone else, and we all know this guy, someone else said, nah, he just looks like him. But the beggar kept saying, yes, I am that same one. They asked, who healed you? What happened? And he told them. The man they called Jesus made mud, and he spread it over my eyes and told me to go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went, and I washed. And now I can see. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees because it was on the Sabbath. that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. And the Pharisees asked the man all about it. So he told them. Just like I just related to you. He told them he put the mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Some of the Pharisees said, "This man Jesus is not from God, for he's working on the Sabbath. For in it thou shalt not do any work." That sounds pretty cut and dried. But others asked, how could an ordinary sinner do such miraculous things? So there was a deep division of opinion among them. Then the Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, "What's your opinion about this guy who healed you?" The man replied, "I think he must be a prophet." The Jewish leaders still refused to believe that the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They would know, right? Right. They called in his parents and they asked him, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how is it that he can now see?" His parents replied, "We know this is our son, and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders and authorities, who had already announced that anyone saying that Jesus was the Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said, "He's old enough, go and ask him yourself." And that's the way it is, isn't it? Isn't it? It's hard to say and do things that might bother some of the folks in the community, particularly if they're church folks. They might judge you or get angry and try and kick you out, in the name of God who loves and accepts everyone just as they are. All right, I'm sorry. That's 4 sermons this morning. We'll finish this one up and not worry about the rest of that. No, it doesn't mean you can miss church for the next month. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page there. So, the Pharisees then called for this man a second time, and they called in the man that had been born blind, and they told him, "God should get the glory for this, because we know this man Jesus is a sinner." Oh, you know? You know, do you? Amazing what we know about, isn't it? Fight it, Appleby. You told him no other sermons. All right, now, they say to him, the man says to him, "I don't know whether he's a sinner," the man replied, "but I do know this. Whereas I was blind, now I can see." This story was from John's Gospel. Mark's Gospel tells us a similar tale of Jesus and his followers working on the Sabbath in direct violation of that commandment. At the end of these stories, Jesus informed those in attendance that the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, and that the Son of Man is Lord, even on the Sabbath. The Sabbath in Judaism is celebrated on the 7th day from sundown Friday through Saturday. On that day, God finished the work of creation. You remember from our story we heard earlier, evening past morning came, that was the first day. That's how they're counted off. In Hebrew, it tells us on this 7th day, God put the finishing touches on creation. If all of creation were the restoring of a classic car, then on the Sabbath day, God polished the chrome. On the Sabbath in our story, Jesus continues the work of creation. He fully forms the eyes of this man who has been born blind, thereby establishing a link between himself and the Father who put the finishing touches on creation so long ago. On Sunday, that's the first day of the week and the 8th day of creation, because on Sunday God began a new work in raising Christ and reconciling the work to himself. In order for us as Christians to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, we've taken upon ourselves the spirit of this 8th day. In it, we welcome the resurrected Christ into our midst. And I urge you today to set aside the rest of your day to spread that work of resurrection. Start it in worship, then move on to study, to prayer, to service to your neighbor, to fellowship, and to rest. In all things, remembering that the Lord who has started the work of creation anew is still at work in our midst. It's in this way that we can remember the Sabbath and keep it holy and still honor the Son of Man who is Lord, even